Hanel's hand slides around the woman's waist like he's done it 100 times in this house. And maybe he has, and 3 feet away, his wife lifts a glass of water to her lips and doesn't spill a single drop. "You're sure she can't?" the woman starts. "Positive." He says it the way other men say the weather's fine. "She hasn't seen a thing in 3 months. Tabia sets the glass down. Her hand doesn't shake. She's had a lot of practice. The woman laughs, quiet and easy, like this is nothing. Like this happens all the time in this mansion, on this couch, 3 feet from a wife who is sitting so still she might as well be furniture. Hanel brushes a strand of hair off the woman's shoulder. Tabia hears the fabric shift. She doesn't need her eyes for that part. What she needs her eyes for is what comes 15 seconds later. The moment his hand moves lower, casual, confident, careless in a way he's never once been careless in front of anyone who could actually see him do it. Tabia sees all of it. She has seen all of it for 3 months. And in a few seconds, once this woman leaves the room, Tabia is going to smile at her husband and ask him, gently, if he'd walk her to bed. Because that's what a blind woman does. She asks for a hand she trusts completely. She has never trusted his hand less. 3 months earlier, none of this had happened yet. 3 months earlier, Tabia had been sitting across from a doctor in a private consultation room, describing symptoms that didn't exist, watching the doctor's face carefully for any flicker of doubt. There wasn't one. Hanel had paid this hospital enough over the years that a diagnosis was less a medical opinion and more a transaction, and Tabia had known that going in, which was exactly why she'd chosen this hospital and not any other. "I need you to write it up as sudden vision loss," she'd told him. "Undetermined cause, I'll handle the rest." The doctor had looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Kang, can I ask why?" "You can ask," she hadn't answered. What she hadn't told the doctor, what she'd barely admitted to herself, was that she needed to know something about her husband that no amount of watching him with open eyes would ever tell her. Hanel performed. He always had. Every kindness, every soft word, every hand on the small of her back when they walked into a room together, she'd started to notice, somewhere around month 2 of their marriage, that all of it happened when there was an audience, when someone was watching him be a good husband. She wanted to know who he was when he believed nobody was watching at all. So she became somebody who couldn't watch. For the first 2 weeks, the test told her nothing except that she'd married a man capable of real tenderness. Hanel canceled meetings. He sat with her for hours reading the specialist reports she'd carefully arranged to be delivered to the house. He held her hand on the stairs even when there was no one else around to see him do it. And for those 2 weeks, Tabia let herself believe, actually believe, that maybe she'd been wrong to doubt him at all. "We'll get through this together," he told her one night, his voice low and rough in a way she'd never heard it before. "Whatever you need." She almost called the whole thing off right there. She almost told him the truth, apologized, let the test end on the best possible version of him. Then week 3 happened. It started small. He came home later. Not much later, 20 minutes 30, but Tabia had learned to read the sound of his footsteps the way sighted people read faces, and something in the rhythm of them had changed. He stopped narrating small things to her, things a genuinely attentive husband does automatically for someone who can't see. "There's a step here, watch your left, I moved the chair." He still walked beside her, but he'd stopped looking at her while he did it. By week 5, there was perfume in the house that wasn't hers. By week 7, there was a woman's voice in the east wing at 11 at night, and Hanel's low laugh underneath it, and Tabia standing in the hallway outside her own bedroom with her hand pressed flat against the wall, counting her own heartbeat until it slowed down enough that she could walk back to bed without her breathing giving her away. She never confronted him, not once. A blind woman wouldn't have known to. If you've ever wondered how far someone will go to find out the truth, drop a like right now if you're already on Tabia's side, because she hasn't even gotten to the worst of it yet, and neither have you. By month 3, it wasn't one woman anymore. It was a rotation. Tabia started recognizing them by their perfume before she ever needed to see their faces. A heavier floral scent on Tuesdays, something sharper and more citrus on the nights he came home past midnight. She catalogued each one silently, the way she'd once catalogued his kindnesses, except now the list only ever grew longer. The staff knew. Of course the staff knew you can't run a house this size and not know everything that happens inside it. Most of them said nothing, trained by fear or loyalty or both. But one evening, a young housekeeper named Sunhee lingered a beat too long while helping Tabia to her seat at dinner, her hand tightening slightly on Tabia's arm. "Mrs. Kang," she said quietly, "if there's ever anything you need, anything at all." It wasn't an offer to help her walk to the table. Tabia understood that immediately. She squeezed Sunhee's hand once, gently, and said nothing, because saying anything at all, even thank you, even I know, would have meant admitting there was something to know. That night, lying beside Hannel in the dark, Tabia realized something had shifted in her without her permission. She wasn't devastated anymore. Devastation had a shelf life, apparently, and hers had expired somewhere around week 9. What was left in its place was quieter, colder, more useful. She stopped flinching at the sounds from the east wing. She started remembering everything instead. The night that ended the test wasn't dramatic. That was almost the worst part. Hannel had brought a woman into the sitting room just off the main hall, not even trying for discretion anymore, not bothering to keep his voice down, because why would he? His wife was 3 rooms away and couldn't see past the end of her own hand. Tabia sat in the adjoining study with a book open on her lap that she wasn't reading, listening to every word carry easily through the half-open door. "Doesn't it bother you?" the woman asked, amused, "having her in the house while we're—" "She'll never know." Hannel's voice easy, almost bored, like the question itself was tedious. "She can't see anything. She doesn't even know you exist." The woman laughed. Tabia's hand, resting on the open page of her book, went very still. "She sits right there sometimes," Hannel went on, smiling at nothing. "Thinking I'm being so attentive. It's honestly a little sad." "Sad?" Tabia closed the book without a sound. She sat with that word for a long moment, turning it over, and something inside her, something that had been bending for 3 months without breaking, finally, quietly, gave way. She wasn't angry. Anger would come later in smaller, more useful doses. What she felt in that moment was something closer to clarity. She had her answer. She'd had it for weeks, really, but this was the sentence that closed the file. She stopped testing him that night. She started planning her exit instead. 6 weeks after that, Tabia sat alone in a private bathroom with a small plastic stick balanced on the edge of the sink, watching a second line appear that changed every calculation she'd made. She didn't cry. She'd expected to, and the absence of tears surprised her more than the pregnancy itself. What she felt instead was a strange, heavy calm, the same calm that had carried her through the last 2 months of quietly cataloging her husband's betrayals. A baby didn't undo any of it, but it complicated the exit she'd been building, piece by careful piece, and Tabia was not a woman who moved without a plan. She told no one, not Hannel, not Sunhee, though she suspected the housekeeper noticed the shift in her anyway. Women who have carried children tend to recognize the signs in each other before anyone says a word. Tabia kept attending her scheduled, specialist appointments, kept letting Hannel believe the blindness was permanent and unexplained, kept smiling at him across the dinner table, while she quietly built a folder of documents, accounts, contacts, a lawyer 3 provinces away who owed her father a favor from another lifetime. Everything she'd need the moment she was ready to walk out the door and never look back. She was 7 months along when Hannel finally noticed. "You've been different," he said one evening, studying her over dinner in a way he hadn't studied her in months. "Quieter." "I'm pregnant, Hannel." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Tabia almost thought he hadn't heard her. Then his chair scraped back, and for one unguarded second, a second she'd remember later, turning it over and over, she heard something in his voice she hadn't heard since the first 2 weeks of the test. He stopped, started again. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." He didn't ask why she hadn't told him sooner. Maybe some part of him already suspected the answer. He came around the table instead and knelt in front of her chair, both hands finding hers with a gentleness that, 2 months ago, might have undone her completely. It didn't anymore. She let him hold her hands and thought about perfume in the East Wing. Somewhere between believing he'd gotten away with everything and finding out what she actually knew, Hannel's whole world is about to flip upside down. And if you think you know how, keep watching, because this is only the beginning of what she's been carrying. Labor came 3 weeks early, in the middle of the night, with no warning beyond a sudden, sharp pain that doubled Tabia over in the hallway outside their bedroom. Hannel found her there. For the first time since she'd known him, the man who never raised his voice, who never let anyone see him rattled, who'd built an empire on being the calmest person in every room, that man was shouting for the car, for the driver, for someone to call the hospital ahead, his hands shaking as he half-carried her down the stairs. "Stay with me," he kept saying over and over in the back of the car, gripping her hand so tightly it almost hurt. "Tabia, stay with me." She wanted to tell him she could see exactly how frightened he looked. She didn't. The hospital took her straight into delivery. Hannel paced outside for what felt to him like days and was in reality just under 6 hours, refusing every offer of coffee, refusing to sit, refusing, for once in his life, to let his phone pull his attention away from the only thing that mattered. His empire could burn. His enemies could circle. None of it registered. All he could think about, standing in that sterile hallway, was the very real possibility that he was about to lose both the people he'd just realized. Too late. He couldn't survive without. When the doctor finally came out, Hannel's whole body went rigid before a single word was spoken. "She's fine," the doctor said. "They're both fine." Hannel didn't remember walking into the room. He remembered the sound the door made. He remembered Tabia, pale and exhausted and radiant in a way that undid something in his chest, holding their daughter against her. Then the doctor mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that they'd like to run one more check on Mrs. Kang's eyes, a standard follow-up, given her condition, and Hannel barely registered the words before the nurse dimmed the lights and asked Tabia to open her eyes slowly. Tabia did. She blinked once, twice, looked around the room with an expression Hannel had never once seen on her face in 3 months, focus, clarity, the unmistakable look of someone actually seeing the space around her. "I can see," she said quietly. Hannel's knees nearly went out from under him with relief. He crossed the room in 2 steps, already reaching for her, already laughing with something that sounded dangerously close to a sob. Then Tabia turned her head and looked directly at him. For 9 months, Hannel had grown so used to being unwatched in his own home that he'd forgotten what it felt like to actually be seen by his wife. Now she was looking straight into his eyes with an expression that held absolutely nothing warm in it at all, and something cold moved through his chest that had nothing to do with relief. "Tabia," he said slowly, "you can see me. I've always been able to see you." The room went very quiet. Somewhere behind them, a machine beeped steadily, indifferent to the moment cracking open between them. "What are you talking about?" Hannel's voice had lost its warmth. "The doctors said—" "I told them what to say." Tabia adjusted their daughter gently in her arms, her voice never rising above a calm, even register that somehow made every word land harder than shouting would have. "I was never blind, Hannel, not for one single day." He stared at her. She watched him run back through months of memory in real time, watched the exact moment his face changed as pieces started falling into place. Every woman he'd brought into their home, every whispered conversation in rooms he'd assumed were private, every time he'd said something cruel or careless believing there was no one in the house capable of catching it. 3 months in, Tabia said, "I wanted to know something, whether you'd stay faithful if you believed I could never watch you do otherwise." Her eyes didn't waver from his. "You didn't." "Tabia, I know about the perfume in the East Wing. I know about Tuesdays. I know what you said to her in the sitting room in March, about how sad it was that I sat there smiling at nothing." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last part, the only crack she allowed herself in the entire conversation. "I heard every word of that, Hannel. I didn't need my eyes for that part." Hannel opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time in his adult life, the most feared man in Seoul had absolutely nothing to say. You didn't betray a blind woman, Tabia said quietly. You betrayed your wife because you believed she was too helpless to ever find out the truth. That's the part I don't think you'll ever understand about what you actually did. She waited 9 months to say those words, and now that she finally has, what do you think happens to a man who's never once had to face consequences in his life? Drop your prediction in the comments, and subscribe if you want to see whether he actually earns his way back, because what happens next isn't what he expects. Hannel didn't fight her in the hospital room. He seemed, for once, to understand there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse. But 3 days after they brought their daughter home, when Tabia set the divorce papers on the table between them, he finally found his voice again, and it wasn't the voice of a man accepting defeat. I'm not signing these. You don't have a choice, Hannel. I have every choice. He didn't raise his voice, but something in it had gone hard, dangerous, the voice she imagined his enemies heard right before things went badly for them. I built everything in this house, everything you have, everything our daughter will have. None of that ever bought my forgiveness. Tabia didn't look away. It never will. He stared at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating, like a man realizing the ground under him wasn't where he'd left it. For the first time in his life, Hannel was facing something his money and his name couldn't simply resolve. He could threaten judges. He could buy silence. He couldn't buy his way back into being a man his wife respected. I'm not signing them today, he said finally. But I'm not fighting you either, not the way you think. Over the following weeks, Tabia watched him do something she hadn't expected. Not grand gestures, not the kind of theater he'd have staged for an audience 2 years ago, but small, unglamorous changes that were harder to fake. He ended things with the women, all of them, in conversations Sunhee later confirmed had actually happened. He started coming home at the same time every night, not because anyone was watching, but seemingly because he wanted to be there. He never once asked Tabia to trust him. He just kept showing up. Tabia didn't sign the papers. She also didn't move back into their shared bedroom. She let him prove himself from a careful, deliberate distance and made no promises about where that distance might lead. Then the threat arrived, and the question of trust became a great deal more urgent than either of them expected. It came in the form of a message left with the house's private security line. No name, no number, just a single line relayed through a nervous guard who clearly understood exactly how much danger that sentence represented. Kang's daughter would be a very effective way to remind him who he owes. Hannel went very still when he heard it. Tabia had seen him controlled, seen him gentle, seen him cruel in ways she was still learning to forgive herself for missing. She had never seen him afraid the way he looked in that moment. Who, Tabia said, not a question about names, a demand. Someone I owe a debt to that I thought I'd already settled. Hannel's jaw was tight. I'll handle it. You'll handle it, Tabia repeated, by telling me exactly what's happening, not by deciding for me what I'm allowed to know. We are far past that, Hannel. For a long moment, he looked like he might argue. Then something in his face gave way, not surrender exactly, but recognition, the same recognition that had been slowly reshaping him since the hospital. He told her everything. The old debt. The rival who'd been circling for years, waiting for exactly this kind of opening. A new baby, a marriage visibly cracked down the middle, a moment of weakness in a man who'd never shown one before. For the first time since their daughter was born, Tabia and Hannel sat on the same side of a problem. The following night, extra security filled the mansion's grounds, men Tabia didn't recognize, moving with the particular quiet efficiency of people who'd done this kind of work before. Hannel didn't leave the house. He didn't take a single call that wasn't related to their daughter's safety. When Tabia found him at 2 in the morning standing over the baby's crib, one hand resting protectively on the rail, she stood in the doorway for a long moment just watching him. You don't have to stand guard all night, she said quietly. I do, actually. He didn't turn around. I spent 3 months not paying attention to the people in this house who mattered most. I'm not making that mistake again. Tabia didn't answer right away. She crossed the room instead and stood beside him, looking down at their daughter's small, sleeping face, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. This doesn't fix what you did, she said finally. I know. I mean it, Hannel. Guarding this room tonight doesn't undo March. It doesn't undo any of it. I know that too. He finally turned to look at her, and there was none of the old performance in his face, no audience to play to, no advantage to gain. Just a man, exhausted and afraid and trying, for what might have been the first genuine time in his life, to be honest. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking you to let me be the kind of man who never gives you a reason to test me again. The threat resolved itself 2 days later. Quietly, the way these things tended to resolve in Hannel's world, with consequences that Tabia didn't ask questions about and Hannel didn't offer to explain. The danger passed. The marriage, whatever remained of it, did not simply snap back into place. Months later, Tabia still hadn't signed the papers, and she still hadn't torn them up either. They sat in a drawer in her study, a quiet, permanent reminder that trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild itself just because the danger has passed and the nights have gotten calmer. Hannel never asked her to throw them away. That, more than anything else he did in those months, was the thing that finally started to matter to her, his willingness to let the papers exist, to let the question of whether stay open indefinitely, rather than pressuring her toward an answer that would have been more convenient for him. One evening, sitting together on the terrace while their daughter slept upstairs, Tabia found herself studying his profile in the fading light, the same face she'd once studied through months of careful, silent observation, looking for exactly this kind of unguarded honesty and never finding it. I still see everything, she said quietly. I want you to understand that. I'm never going to be the woman sitting in the corner not noticing things again. I don't want that woman, Hannel said. I never should have wanted her in the first place. Tabia didn't answer that with forgiveness. She wasn't there yet, and she'd stopped pretending timelines like that could be rushed. But she let her hand rest, briefly, against his on the table between them. Not a promise, not yet, just an acknowledgement that the distance between them had gotten a little smaller than it used to be, one honest evening at a time. The papers stayed in the drawer. Whether they'd ever come out again was still, entirely, her decision to make. If you've ever had to decide whether someone's actions after the fact were enough to undo what came before, you already know how impossible Tabia's decision really is. Hit like if you think she made the right call keeping those papers in the drawer. Tell me in the comments, would you have signed them, or given him the same chance she did? And subscribe, because there's a lot more where this one came from.